"Help me hang the laundry, Jenna," Grandma said from outside. When her grandma asked for assistance around the house, Jenna never turned her down. "The laundry is about finished, though." 10 minutes later, Grandma said, "Let's go make dinner." They were the only two living together. As a ritual, they prepared Sunday dinner every weekend, even though there was no one else to serve. Every time they set Grandma's favorite dishes on the round table, they covered it with a white tablecloth, adorned it with a small bouquet of flowers, and arranged the tastiest cuisine on the table. In their little household, it had always been customary. Mrs. Fox liked to say, "Well, even though there are no men in the house, we will pamper ourselves. Even a small family like ours has to have customs, Jenna. Because there is always something constant and unalterable. Living with tradition is simpler and more joyful." Jenna, traditions are wonderful. You should prepare the table for a family meal on Sundays when you have your own family, which includes your spouse and kids. Everyone will then be aware ahead of time that it's a day to stay at home, talk, provide counsel to the younger generation, and get advice from the elder generation. Since she was a little girl, Jenna had always envisioned herself with a big family. She longed for a father or an older brother, but it wasn't that living by herself with her grandmother was unpleasant. She was curious about what it was like to be supported and shielded by a man. In contrast, her friend Heather could use her father, a police officer, or her elder brother, a boxer, to intimidate criminals. Jenna, however, had no grandfather at all. Her grandma and an elderly dog named Finn, who had previously served alongside the neighbor's nephew on the border, were her only guardians. Grandma took Finn in when he grew too old for them to put him to sleep. Even though he became nearly sight and deaf, he lived for 7 more years. Every time Mrs. Fox left their little village for the metropolis, the old hound always went with her to the train. He made it a point to see Jenna off each day when she grew up and started college. Jenna used to say, "You don't have to follow me sharply." She pitied the elderly dog. "You're hardly moving at all. Return home." For a while, Finn still tried to waddle after his beloved younger mistress. But soon, his strength finally left him, and he could only look sadly after her. "Someday, like Finn, I won't be able to see Jenna off or greet her properly," Mrs. Fox said, saddened as she watched the old dog. "Why such gloomy thoughts, Grandma? You're only 67 years old. I still have you. You'll have great-grandchildren, I'm certain." "Oh, I'd like to believe it, Jenna," Grandma sighed. "But I don't know if I'll be healthy enough." Finn died while Jenna was in the city. When she came back, she saw the old dog frozen in waiting. He had never managed to meet his mistress for the last time. The girl cried for a long time. A week later, she wanted to bring home a new puppy so she and her grandmother wouldn't feel so sad. "No need, granddaughter," Mrs. Fox told her. "You have to go to the city anyway, and it will be difficult for me to look after a dog alone. I'm getting old. I don't have much strength left." Jenna was very upset listening to the complaints of her dearest person. She didn't want to move to the city, so she continued to travel there every day by train, even after finding a job there. But thanks to these trips, she met her destiny. One autumn evening, returning home at dusk, she saw a group of drunken local hooligans beating up a stranger. The incident was not far from the railroad station. Apparently, the man couldn't leave the inhospitable neighborhood in peace. By the time Jenna reached the scene, the attackers had already fled. It wasn't surprising that they ran away quickly. She had screamed at the top of her voice and called the police. The poor guy lay in a pool of his own blood, his nose broken and ribs fractured. He could barely stand. Jenna called an ambulance, and not wanting to leave the stranger alone in a strange city, went with him to the hospital. David, as the man was called, turned out to be an interesting person. He and Jenna became friends, and she visited him in the hospital frequently. That's how she met his parents. "Jenna, you're like a guardian angel for our son. If you hadn't arrived in time, who knows how things would have ended," David's mother said one day. The men who had attacked David were found. As it turned out, the drunken group had spotted a stranger, and as often happens in such cases, Alcohol had given them a sense of recklessness. One thing led to another, and David was drawn into a fight against his will. When the chaos settled, his attackers didn't even remember why they had targeted him. "You'll be like a daughter to us now, Jenna. Come visit. My husband and I will always be happy to see you," David's mother told her warmly. David was discharged from the hospital, and his parents came to take him home. David and Jenna smiled conspiratorially at each other. They hadn't yet told his parents that they had decided to get married. "Mom, you won't believe this, but you're really going to see a lot of Jenna now," David announced with a wink. "You have no idea how often I invited her to come and live with us. We've been a couple for 2 weeks now, and yesterday I proposed." And Jenna agreed. "So get ready, Mom. There's a wedding coming." David's parents were surprised by the young couple's hasty decision, but on the other hand, they were happy for their son. Jenna was well liked, and David's parents were glad that the girl who had so touchingly taken care of their son all this time would become his wife. "Don't worry about me, Jenna," her grandmother comforted her. "I'll be all right. If anything, the neighbor will help. Go to the city. You can't stay near me forever. Go and be happy, and if you're happy, I'll be happy too." Mrs. Fox hugged her granddaughter, and Jenna realized that her grandmother was letting her go with a light heart. The wedding took place at the end of January, and in early March, Jenna and David learned that they would soon become parents. Spring brought great happiness into their lives. David's parents and Mrs. Fox constantly called each other, and the grandmother knew all the news about the young couple's life. "I already know that you went for an ultrasound yesterday," the elderly woman joyfully reported to her granddaughter. "David's mom has already told me everything. How are you feeling? Can you come to me on Easter? I've cleaned the house, and I'll get some more aromatic herbs. We'll have Sunday dinner like we used to." Throughout the summer, Jenna enjoyed her pregnancy. She often visited her grandmother in the village, mostly with her husband on weekends. Mrs. Fox enjoyed these visits like a small child enjoys a new toy, and Jenna and David never denied her the pleasure of being with them. In the village, Jenna often met her best friend, Heather, who also visited her parents on weekends since she worked in the city. "Now I envy you, Jenna," Heather sighed. "David is so kind and caring, unlike my last suitor. I always end up dating some kind of moral freak or couch potato. Oh, by the way, do you remember Helen? She has a terrible story. Her husband turned out to be an abuser." Jenna thought she hadn't heard correctly. "He was an abuser?" she repeated. It turns out that she was often humiliated and beaten by him, and she didn't tell anyone. Maybe Helen was embarrassed or afraid, who knows. Recently, he even locked her in the house for 3 days because he was jealous and wouldn't let her out. Thankfully, the neighbors called the police, and she was eventually released. Now they have a case against the jealous husband. Helen confessed that he had been torturing her like that for years. "What a horror," Jenna marveled. She realized how lucky she was to have David. They were like two halves of the same whole, separated at birth by fate but able to meet thanks to chance. Jenna couldn't even imagine that David could ever look at her badly, let alone raise his hand against her. Listening to Heather's stories was like listening to horror tales. A happy childhood with her beloved grandmother and a successful marriage with a loving husband had shielded Jenna from many horrors that might have come her way. "David, you know, I've been thinking," she said. "I've realized how lucky we are. Few people are so fortunate. Some people live with someone they don't love, suffer, or can't have children, but we, thank God, are doing well, aren't we?" David nodded silently and kissed her tenderly. He truly loved his wife and couldn't imagine how his life would have turned out if he hadn't met her that cold autumn evening. Now it was autumn again. Jenna was 7 months pregnant. She and David knew they were expecting a boy and had already chosen the name Thomas in honor of David's grandfather. "My grandfather was a decent man with a big heart," David said. "He was smart. He grew up without a father. My great-grandfather was killed in the war. From his early youth, he carried the whole family on his back. All our successes, especially our current ones, are thanks to him. Jenna listened and smiled. She was ready to call her son any name her husband chose because she trusted him completely in everything. She trusted him with her life and the life of their future child. Jenna enjoyed strolling through the autumn park, rustling the golden leaves and inhaling the warm smell of fallen leaves in peace. Sometimes she would sit on a bench and quietly talk to her baby. "Tommy, we are all waiting for you so much," she whispered. "You will be a happy baby, coming into this world with the most loving, friendly family. I can't wait to see your eyes, your tiny hands and feet, and kiss your tiny nose, my sunshine." That afternoon, Jenna was returning from a walk when a car suddenly sped toward her out of nowhere. She was leisurely walking across the road on the crosswalk, and the last thing she remembered was the horrible sound of brakes and a thud from the side. She didn't even have time to fully realize what had happened before everything went black. Days later, Jenna woke up in the hospital. "She came to her senses," was the first phrase she heard. Her grandmother was next to her, her face swollen from days of sleep deprivation and tears. Jenna couldn't understand what had happened. "Grandma, why am I in the hospital?" "I don't remember anything," Jen asked. "Granddaughter, we'll talk later." "Not now," her grandmother replied. Jenna was confused and wanted to know the truth about her condition. "Grandma, tell me honestly, what's wrong with me?" "Jenna, you were hit by a car. You have many bruises and a concussion. Let's talk more about it later. You need to rest now," her grandmother said, trying to comfort her. "And the baby?" Janet asked fearfully, only now realizing that the accident might have harmed the child. Mrs. Fox did not answer. She turned away from her granddaughter so that she would not see the tears running down her cheeks. "Jenna, honey, calm down, please. You're still young. The doctor said you can still have children." "I don't want other children. I want my tummy." Jenna was terrifying to look at. The swelling had not yet gone down on her face, and bruises and cuts were visible everywhere. But that was not what was frightening. The woman's gaze was completely insane. At the sound of her scream, a nurse rushed in and injected Jenna with a sedative. The woman fell into a deep sleep. While she slept, all her loved ones gathered at her bedside, trying to find out from the doctor what they should do with Jenna now. "You need to understand that she has more than just a head injury. It's quite possible that the stress she's been under is going to cause mental problems in the near future. You should definitely show her to a good psychiatrist." Things were terrible for Jenna at home. She refused to accept the truth. The woman was still talking to the baby that was no longer in her belly. She didn't want to believe that her little angel had flown off to heaven and kept singing songs to him, dreaming of what he would grow up to be. My little sunshine, how I long to see your eyes, your tiny hands, your tiny feet, and to kiss your tiny nose, my joy." It was impossible to watch all this without crying. The whole family felt like they were starting to go crazy along with Jenna. "We need to solve the question of hospitalization at the mental clinic urgently," insisted David's father. "Dad, how can I leave her now? She needs me. I want to be with Jenna." "Well, then the two of you will go crazy. Who's going to feel better?" A couple of days later, it got worse. Jenna stopped responding to people at home. She would either stare at one point or start pacing the house thoughtfully, as if looking for someone. "All right, I'll go and talk to the doctor, and then I'll take her too." David finally gave up. But when he returned home, Jenna was not in the house. "I only ran to the grocery store for a minute." David's mother excused herself. "How did I know she would want to go out?" The whole family rushed to look for the missing woman, but Jenna was nowhere to be found. David and his father immediately went to the village where her grandmother lived. But even there, Jenna was not found. She did not show up at home the next day either. Soon, the police were looking for her, but couldn't find her anywhere. It was as if Jenna had vanished into thin air. David could not find a place for his grief. He looked for his beloved wherever she had been before. He went to acquaintances and distant relatives of the family and wandered through parks and forests like a ghost. He questioned random passersby and pasted wanted posters on poles and the walls of houses. All acquaintances and strangers helped him. Heather, Jenna's friend, was especially worried and tried to help David. "Do not worry. We will definitely find her, and the police will not abandon us." My father promised that they would not stop looking for her. Time passed, but there was no progress in Jenna's case. 5 years passed. Sadly, Jenna had to be officially recognized as dead. During these years, Heather was at David's side. Their common grief had united them. Eventually, they decided to link their fates. David's mother blamed herself for the disappearance of her first daughter-in-law, but was glad that David had come to terms with what happened and had finally begun to build a new relationship with Jenna's friend. She liked Heather and feared there was no real love between her son and this woman. However, life showed that the young couple had indeed fallen in love with each other and had already begun to dream of having a child. After getting married, the couple decided to go on a honeymoon, not abroad, but to the cultural capital of the country, which Heather had long dreamed of visiting. She wanted to see all the museums and famous monuments of architecture. David had once studied in this city and still had some friends from his youth there. "Did you know that there is a kissing bridge in this city? We must go there first," whispered David, hugging his wife. There is an old belief: if newlyweds start kissing on one side of the river, continue on the bridge, and kiss until they reach the other side, they will live happily ever after together. They did just that. It was the happiest day of Heather's life, even happier than their wedding, which they decided not to make big and lavish, but intimate, with only their closest friends and relatives in attendance. When they kissed on the bridge, all the people around them smiled, admiring this beautiful and joyful couple. When they reached the other side of the river, Heather told her husband that she had saved one surprise until then. She was pregnant. David picked his wife up in his arms and spun her around. He was crazy with happiness. "David, be careful. Put me down immediately," Heather asked, laughing. "What are our plans for the near future?" "Now, we will go for a walk, admire the sights, and then go to the hotel. But tomorrow, my old friend is waiting for us for Sunday lunch. Michael and I studied together. We lived in the same room in the student dormitory. We haven't seen each other for many years. Can you imagine? He has a son who just turned 3 years old the other day. When he found out we'd be here, he asked me not to plan anything on Sunday. They have a tradition, Sunday dinners, just like we used to do when I and Jenna." David stopped himself abruptly. "Oh, it's okay, David," said Heather, trying not to show her pain. "Jenna took this tradition from her grandmother, but other people also have this tradition. Anyway, I'd love to visit your friend." David felt very guilty and therefore was especially tender and attentive towards his wife that evening. The next day, they bought gifts for their friend's family: flowers, cognac, and a children's motorcycle on batteries. Soon, a joyful David and Heather were standing on the threshold of Michael's apartment, exactly at the appointed time. The friends embraced, and Michael invited them into the living room. "Jenna, we have guests. Meet my friend David and his wife, Heather." What happened next cannot be described in words. Michael was bewildered as Heather, essentially a stranger, rushed toward his wife, sobbing as she embraced her. Meanwhile, David, white as chalk, began to say something that, in Michael's opinion, sounded absurd. "Jenna, you died 5 years ago. It's impossible. Where have you been all this time? Oh my goodness." It all seemed like the ravings of a madman, but as Michael looked at his wife, he began to suspect something. When he first met Jenna 5 years prior, she had no documents, no money, and most importantly, was in a semi-delirious state. She remembered absolutely nothing, neither who she was nor what had happened to her. But now, as Jenna shifted her gaze from Heather to David, it was as if a veil had fallen from her eyes. "Tommy, my little son," Jenna whispered. This was the first thing she said after several heavy minutes of silence. Then she began to cry. "Jenna," Michael said, embracing his wife and addressing her like a little child, "our son's name is Chris." Jenna fainted, and David's pregnant wife wasn't in the best condition either. It was hard to believe, but Jenna had been found, and found when no one was even looking for her. Only Jenna's grandmother had continued to pray and believe that her granddaughter was alive. That's why, when all four of them slowly began to come to their senses, the first thing they did was call Jenna's grandmother. Throughout the years, David and Heather had not forgotten about the elderly lady. They often called her and supported her as best they could, both morally and financially. After Jenna's disappearance, Mrs. Fox had been very ill. Only the hope of meeting her granddaughter, along with the medicine and vitamins David brought her, had somehow kept her alive. "Mrs. Fox, good afternoon," David said, deciding to call his grandmother-in-law first. The young people were afraid that hearing Jenna's voice on the receiver might make the elderly woman ill from shock. "How are you feeling?" David asked. "Oh, David, thank you. I'm doing well. How are you? How's Heather?" "We're doing well too. And we have some good news for you about Jenna. We found her. She's alive, and she's doing great. She lost her memory back then, but she remembers everything now. I'll put her on the phone." During Jenna's conversation with her grandmother, there were many tears and few words. But the main thing the elderly lady could understand was that she had a great-grandson, and that very soon they would come to visit her. "Grandma, there's someone else I need to introduce to you. His name is Michael. He's my husband and Chris's father. I love him very much. He's very nice, and you're sure to love him too." As Jenna spoke, Michael and Heather breathed a sigh of relief. Years had passed, and nothing could be changed. They had their own families now. The most important thing was that they finally knew what had happened to Jenna, and that all four of them would remain friends. However, there was still David. Both Michael and Heather looked at him almost simultaneously and realized there would be no problems on his part either. David accepted this difficult situation and had no intention of ruining Jenna's family. After all, he had his beloved Heather and was eagerly awaiting the birth of their child. A week later, they were all standing together on Mrs. Fox's doorstep. Sunday dinners were sacred, and now their family was bigger than ever before. At the head of the table, of course, was little Chris, the family sweetheart and the long-awaited great-grandson of the elderly grandmother.